So both of these lures have been sanded up to including 80 grit and 120 grit, and we're actually ready to use the Forstner bit and cut in some eye sockets. What you're going to see is me standing in front of the drill press in just a few seconds, and I am going to central. Can you see the little point on the Forstner bit? I'm going to center that into the hole, and then I'm going to maneuver the lure by hand to try and get that thing to hit the wood as parallel as possible. Because this is curved, you can't be perfect, and then you're going to see just a little bit of material being removed. I'll check it, make sure it's deep enough. If it's not, I'll go back and take a little bit more out, and then that's how the sockets are done. One of the little tricks, however, I saw on one of the YouTube channels is how to prep this wood prior to hitting it with a Forstner bit. If you're going to get any tear out, you always get the tear out when you first enter the hole. Once you've gone by the edge, you're good to go. So what this other lure maker had suggested, and I've done it ever since, is I put a little tiny bit of epoxy. Now normally I would use super glue because it glues pretty quickly. Today I don't have any. My little bottle, of course, when you go to use it, haven't used it for a month or three, it's rock solid. So I'm going to actually put 5-minute epoxy here, and I have to take off. I'm going to come back in about 2 hours, and that's when I'm in a good situation to use the Forstner bit. So I'm going to do that, and I'm going to cut most of that out of the video, but I'll come back and actually dab on this stuff to see really how little you really do need. I put a little bit on the tip of my finger, and I just kind of mush it around a little bit. You don't want much. You'll be able to sand off anything that kind of sticks up and doesn't get cut off. Both sides. And then kind of prop it up so it doesn't stick to anything. So we're in the garage now. We've got our drill press set up with our Forstner bit, and the table for the drill press is pushed away to give me some support. I've got all my safety equipment on. I've got my gloves, I've got my protective glasses and hearing protection. And just a reminder that the little tip of the Forstner bit I'm going to put into this hole, and then I'm going to move, you're going to see me, I'm going to move this around a little bit to get the best fit. So I'm trying to put a flat hole on a curved surface, and it won't be perfect, but I can see how it's digging and correct the angle of it, and that's why this is really the only way that this will work. So let's try this. Good. There we've got our socket. Take my glove off here, and always have an eyeball here to install. And you'll see fits great. You can see the bulge on it. So we're just going to do one more and call her done. if you do it right, it's a pretty simple process. Again, you can see the bulge on this one. There's a little bit more sanding to go on, and next time you see this lure, we may be, well, it will be completely painted and ready for epoxy. And it's quite possible that we may have to clean out this hole from paint and stuff that gets into it. So we may be visiting this Forstner bit one more time. And we may also be painting the inside outer edge of this hole black, just so it doesn't show through. And I'll show you examples of why you would want to do that. One of the last tasks that we have to do for this lure to get the eye right is we have to fill up this hole here that I showed you earlier in the videos. And in order to do that, I have to sand down these areas so they're just right. Inevitably, you sand over top of the eye socket. So there's a couple things that have to happen before you can actually finish off that socket. You have to finish this nose, and then you can go back and check your eye sockets, and you may have to re-drill them a little tiny bit. When you're sanding along these sides here, you can actually take those the edges of the sockets right off, and so to make them right, you have to go back. So I'll do a quick explanation of how I do that. One of the things I do is I drill a hole down the center of that channel. Now, bear in mind, this is all filled up with lead now. So I drill down, well, maybe about half an inch, maybe a little bit more. And what I then do is I come back and I dribble 2-part epoxy in there, 5-minute epoxy actually. And as I get the epoxy into the hole, I put a little piece of tape on like this, and I fill it up. Now this tape acts like a mold, and what you really don't want to happen is you don't want to be short on this 2-part epoxy on this nose, because what happens is if you're short and you come back and you try and put a little bit more epoxy on, it's not going to stick very well. And that's where I've had some failures. A small bump, and all of a sudden that second layer just kind of falls off. You can actually see through the 5-minute epoxy where the actual nose is and where the poured nose extends. This comes off very, very easily with a little Dremel tool with a little sanding barrel on it, and this takes literally seconds to fix. And this is what you wind up with. You wind up with a very nice hard nose. And what happens, of course, is when you're bringing these lures in from trolling them, they may bump into the boat. And if you were to leave this, say with just ordinary wood filler, it would certainly blunt that nose, and it wouldn't look good. So this is a very hard nose. The 2-part epoxy I use is Gorilla 5-minute epoxy, and it just gets harder and harder and harder. And you'll see now that this nose is all nicely sculpted. And the only thing, I've actually trimmed up these sockets, and really the only thing I have left to do before I paint this lure is I have to put a little tiny bit of filler around this epoxy to make sure that by the time I paint it is invisible, like join. The 2 lures that we've been working on are now ready for their eyes. They've been filled up with lead. Both of them weigh around 400 grams, very, very heavy lures. They've had their 3 coats of oil-based paint. These are sealer coats. And now they've had their base color added. So this pink lure here is for a friend of mine who lives in Spokane, and he wanted just pink. So he's going to have pink, and he's going to have a gill, and he's going to have these nice red eyes. For me, I want a black one because I've seen Wahoo hit black, and black is easier for them to see against the sky. So this is a good color as well. Pink is great, but black is okay too. So one of the first things we do just prior to putting the eye in is we're going to actually test fit it. Last thing you'd want to do is get epoxy in the holes and find out, oh, there's a lump of stuff. So I just do a little bit of a quick test here. Make sure that it's going to fit. Now it looks okay. Now one of the interesting things about these eyes is there's a reason that they call them living eyes. These are actually done from photographs, and this is a picture of the eye in the package, and you'll notice there's a little dark spot at the bottom, and there's a better picture here, and you can see this line goes at the bottom. So one of the things I like to do, being again a little bit OCD, is make sure that those eyes get installed like this picture. Now the black lure, I've chosen the eyes called Ice, and again I'll just put it in the hole there and just make absolutely sure that there's not going to be a problem when I got that epoxy in there. Sorry, these eyes also have an unusual shape. They're not perfectly round, they're teardrop, and the little point here, if you look at the back, goes towards the front of the fish. So it's got to look something like this. This is not quite ready, but it's pretty darn close. So we're ready to mix some epoxy. One of the things I'm going to do though is I'm going to prop up the heads of the lures so they're fairly level. Now the reason I want to do that is I don't want the eye to slide off. Now one of the things I've been hinting at is that the fact that these eye sockets are going to contain the eyes. That's not quite accurate. What I do to get that nice bulge is I will fill up the entire eye socket right to the top with epoxy. Then I come back and I put the eye on top of it. Now bear in mind the eye has a little bit of adhesive on the bottom. So really what I'm doing is I'm putting that adhesive in contact with the 5-minute epoxy. That's not real strong. After it all hardens, you could probably flick it off with your finger. But there are 2 to 3 coats of epoxy that are going to go over top of this, so that will hold the eye. Now, one of the reasons you want to do this, and this may not be obvious until you actually do it, is if you were to use super glue, for example, you would put a couple drops of super glue onto the eye, pop in the eye, hold it down, and boom, you're done. And you think, well, all I need to do is hold that eye until I get my first coat of epoxy. The problem with that is, and this happens like 50% of the time, that contact surface down below here is quite rough. So there's actually quite a bit of air trapped underneath the eye. Now why does that matter? Okay, so you've got this thing on the spinner and you're putting epoxy over top of the eye, and of course the epoxy wants to creep into the holes, so you get bubbles coming out. So 3 or 4 or 5 minutes you're popping bubbles, and now you've put on the epoxy and you're popping the bubbles and you're starting to spin it, and you're checking about every 15 minutes just to make sure there's nothing wrong. And then there's more bubbles, and there's more bubbles, and there's more bubbles, and finally you get to a point where there's no more bubbles, and you think, wow, I'm done. I can relax now. I can just spin this thing on a spinner and come back in 6-7 hours and it'll be done. Well, the problem is, inevitably, bubbles will come out. And you're not going to notice them, you're not going to be there to pop them. And you get bubbles hardened after the epoxy is hardened. And you get kind of a wart on the eye, and it's annoying. Now you can cut it off, and then the next coat, which would be the second coat of epoxy, will fill it in, but it's never quite as nice. So by putting in the epoxy and filling it up, and putting the eye over top of the epoxy, and kind of pushing it down a little bit with the end of the scalpel, you reduce the amount of air, and then you reduce the amount of bubbling, and your job just turns out that much nicer. So one thing I've got here is I've got this X-Acto. It could be anything, just to basically make the lure stay straight. Now you got to use cloth because that paint is still quite soft, and sometimes if it doesn't sit quite right, you've got to use whatever you've got to try to make that level. Okay, so mix up some epoxy. I'll probably cut this part out, but here I'm applying 5-minute epoxy into the hole, making sure it gets everywhere. And of course, again, I'm trying to reduce the amount of air that's in there. And I find that I can handle about 2 eyes at a time. And after I put the eye in, I'm not just going to walk away and say, hey, we're done. I'm going to be looking. It's 5-minute epoxy will starting to stiffen in 1 to 2 minutes, and then after 15 minutes it's really not going to go anywhere. Now this thing is getting quite full. Put the epoxy in the other eye at the same time. Right now is the time when the epoxy is least viscous. And bear in mind, this epoxy simply has to hold the eye raised up a little bit so it bulges. And then after 15 minutes, you can actually flip it over and do the other side. Now, just an FYI, it's quite common to put these eyes in having too much epoxy, like I've got a little bit too much epoxy in this guy. So what happens is you get a little bit of epoxy around the eye. And you think, wow, I've got to get rid of that. Well, because it's clear epoxy, when you put the eye in, when you put the epoxy on the whole lure, it will actually make that little ridge disappear. won't be able to see it. Now these things will tend to drift around a little bit, so got to make sure you're paying attention, and when they drift a little bit you bring it back. And pushing them down a little bit brings out a little bit of epoxy around the edge, and of course what you want is you want the epoxy from the body to kind of gently go over the eyes, and that's what's going to make it look very natural. Now you can see here I've got a little bit of epoxy that is snuck out. If I was super OCD, which I maybe am a little bit, I would try and get that out of there, maybe using a Q-tip or something. But because I know it's going to disappear with the epoxy coat, I'm just going to leave it. And when we come back after the first coat of epoxy, you're going to see that first coat of epoxy, because this lure is going to be on a spinner, that epoxy is going to be sloshed around a little bit. Not slosh is maybe a bit overstated, but it's going to be moving around. And it's going to make a very nice transition from the eye to the lure. It's going to look very, very natural. So that's how I install eyes. And the next time you see these lures, they'll have had not only one coat of epoxy, but they'll also have, this lure is going to have some stripes put on it, it's going to have some gills put on it, and the second coat is really an indication that that lure is done. So we're very, very close to finishing. So I've got the lure clamped to my spinner. Thought I'd show you how I apply the first layer of epoxy. Not really rocket science, however, if you don't put on enough, you get something called fish eyes. If you put on too much, you get kind of dripping. So the only suggestion I can offer you is put on the right amount, and that's a kind of a trial and error thing. One thing I will admit to as well is I use a microwave to warm up my epoxy. I'll start off with about, maybe 5 seconds, and then now bear in mind I've added the two components together, and what happens is the epoxy, if it's maybe a little bit too cold, will look like it's got little tendrils in it, and these tendrils will go away with mixing, but they'll go away even better with a little bit of heating from the microwave. So after the first 5 seconds, I'll mix a little bit. Most often that's not quite enough, and then I'll come back and give it another 3 seconds, You can tell by the short amounts there's not a lot of heating. And then stir it up some more, and then based on that, either give it another 3 seconds or complete the mixing, and then you set it for 3 minutes, and then you run a hot air gun through it to get rid of any small little bubbles, and then you're basically ready to go. Now, once this spinner gets going, and I'll show you how it looks when it gets going, there are bubbles on there, and then you have to use the hot air gun or torch to get rid of the bubbles. So anyway, I'm going to finish off the actual application, and I'll come back and show you what the unit looks like when it's working. You can see the spinner spinning right now. You can hear it clunking away in the background. And what I generally do is let it spin for a minute or two, and then I'm going to come back and get my hot air gun out and try and get rid of some of the bubbles. So this will take two coats, and you can actually see some of the bubbles. Hopefully the camera can catch that. And those will go away once the hot air gun gets after them. So as completion of the lure, I still have gills to put on, I still have side fins, and I still have stripes. So the lures themselves are not quite finished, but the eyes have been installed, and they are pretty much done. Now, once the layers of epoxy get put on, the interface between the eye and the lure itself will become very, very smooth. And when you first put the eye on, it could be a little bit blockish, the way the eye and the lure come together. But the epoxy will fix all of that. So the next time you see these lures, these should be all done, including all of their other little things that have to be done. Just a reminder about what we're looking for here. The whole purpose of this part 1 and part 2 was to get these eyes mounted just right where it got the bulge. So this is just a reminder. So this is the lure that I think was perfect. I mentioned just a few seconds ago, for you anyway, on the video, that these two lures would be, next time you see them, that they would be done. And a couple things happened. I thought I would take the opportunity to show some good things, i.e. the eyes. So let's look at this guy. He's as close to perfect as I can make it. This one, this eye over here is a little bit sunken. So the learning that I have, because I'm always learning, is that when I put the epoxy into the eye socket, I should probably wait about 2 to 3 minutes, because this one leaked a lot of 5-minute epoxy out from underneath the eye and went in a little bit. So that's my learning. So next time I do eyes, I'll make sure that I wait 2 to 3 minutes out of the 5 minutes it takes. And what that will do is that will firm up the epoxy, and when you put the eye on top of it, you can push it down a little bit and make sure it mates with the epoxy, but it won't just kind of run away on you. But during the making of these two lures, I ran into a couple of little problems, and very often on these YouTube videos you see the finished product and everything is wonderful, and you go to try it yourself and all of a sudden you've got all kinds of problems. So this lure, don't know if you can see that, has fish eyes on the first coat. I have had a persistent problem with fish eyes that occur always on the first coat, and then the second coat covers them up. So it's not that you can see them, but it's annoying because if I wanted to put some stripes on here, I'd have to give it its second coat. And usually I like to put the stripes like on this one on a first coat, and then the second coat will of course give it another layer of protection, and then maybe even a third coat. So these fish eyes, I have had a perpetual problem. They show up from time to time, and then if you notice on this other side, you know, they're done at both sides were done at exactly the same time. It's absolutely perfect. So I kind of think that when I used the hot air gun, maybe I gave it too much hot air. That's my guess. Now another problem, and as perfect as I said that this one looks because of the eyes are so nice, this one has a lump on its tail. So I mentioned about the amount of epoxy to put on being a little bit difficult to gauge, and this actually, through its entire spinning cycle, managed to get a fairly good sized lump down here. So you notice that I didn't finish off the stripes on top of that lump. So I'm going to have to actually grind that off. Of course, you got to be very careful you don't damage the paint underneath. And then once you put a second coat on, the epoxy will go into the scratches and you'll never see it. But I just wanted to show you some of the real life problems that happen when you're making these lures, and you know, things don't always work out as you'd like. However, this is my best one out of this whole video, and I want to thank you for joining me on this little journey, this OCD journey to make these lures as perfect as you can. Really, the techniques that I've shown you are more applicable to the larger eyes. So this is a 15mm eye, or 5/8 of an inch, and that's a big enough eye that you can tell if they're done right. The smaller ones, the 10mm, the 7mm, it's pretty hard to make them perfect, but they're so small you will tend not to notice them anyway. But these bigger lures, you can certainly make a difference in how you set the eyes. And one last thing, you remember I had a little bit of epoxy squeeze out from underneath these eyes, and that epoxy that made that little ridge is disappeared because the epoxy, the 5-minute epoxy and the longer term epoxy that I use to coat these are the same color, and they just disappear. So you can't see that little ridge, and it fills it in. So both of these lures are going to be great for Wahoo, and I'm sure the Wahoo won't notice that this eye is sunken in, I don't know, 32nd of an inch. So thanks again for joining me on this this journey, and I'm not quite sure what I'll do next. I'm thinking that I'm going to make a stick bait. I have a really nice stick bait that I made a few years ago, and I think I might revisit that stick bait, and in light of perhaps some new skills that I've gotten over the years. So thanks again. See you on the next one. Bye now.